Instead of enriching a child's mind, these games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture. For those who have not seen these so-called games before, I want to show you what we're talking about. What you're about to see are scenes from two of the most violent new video games. First, we have Mortal Kombat, which is a martial arts contest involving digitized characters. We're going to show two versions of the game. In the first segment, which is SEGA's version, blood splatters from the contestants' heads. When a player wins, the so-called death sequence begins. The game narrator instructs the player to finish, and I quote, finish his opponent. The player may then choose a method of murder, ranging from ripping a heart out to pulling off the head of the opponent with spinal cord attached. The second version, made by Nintendo, leaves out the blood and decapitation, but as you will see, it is still a violent game. The second game is Night Trap, which is a game set in a sorority house. The object is to keep hooded men from hanging the young woman from a hook or drilling their necks with a tool designed to drain their blood. Night Trap uses actual actors and achieves an unprecedented level of realism. What is particularly troubling about the scene in this film that we have an extract of is a graphic depiction of the violence against women with strong overtones of sexual violence. I find this segment deeply offensive and believe that it simply should be taken off the market. Thank you, Senator Cole. Well, the tapes are ready, which I described before. They begin with the two sequences from Mortal Kombat. The first is the SEGA version. The second, regrettably, is a very brief but nonetheless illustrative sequence from the Nintendo version. Go ahead. For a lot of you to see, but there's blood splattering every time.
Kato wins. Flawless victor fatality. Fight.
And this is a brief sequence from the Nintendo version. Now, the difference there, as you can see, is that that version does not have the finishing sequences, the death sequences, and in fact, instead of red blood spurting out, there's some other liquid, but it doesn't look like blood. Now we'll go to the Night Trap sequence.
Megan, this isn't gonna work. You're not scaring me. Wait. What are you doing now? Megan,
That's all there is.
continue. We'd like to thank you all for being here today. In order that we can move the hearing on. Second, let me say that I share Senator Lieberman's outrage at the excerpts that we will be viewing on the TV. Mortal Kombat and Night Trap are not the kind of gifts that responsible parents give. Night Trap, which adds a new dimension of violence specifically targeted against women, is especially repugnant. It ought to be taken off the market entirely, or at the very least, its most objectionable scenes should be removed.
It has been quite a leap from Pac-Man to Night Trap. About 2 months ago, I saw the video game Night Trap for the first time. It is a sick, disgusting video game, in my judgment. It's an effort to trap and kill women. Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse, in my judgment. And I know there will be people who say, well, we sit up here as the thought police, trying to suggest what people can see or do. It's not my intention. We have some basic responsibility in this country to protect children.
Dr. Provenzo?
I think there are a couple of things. One is that a lot of people in the industry say that these things simply reflect what's in the culture. I think that by manufacturing games like Night Trap, what in point of fact these manufacturers are doing are endorsing that violence. And I think that's really objectionable.
And a woman since the day I was born. And let me tell you, on all my labels and all the hats I wear, I find that so extremely offensive, and the only word you can say to the manufacturers and the shareholders of the company is shame on you. And I think that they really should stop and think about what they're doing. I mean, how would you like to have a teenage daughter go out on a date with someone who's just watched or played 3 hours of that game?
Senator Lieberman.
Thank you, Senator Cole, and thanks to all the members of the panel. Just hearing what you've said now, we're also repelled. We're disgusted by this material, and yet it is a measure of our values in this society that we resist the impulse to do what I think, let me say for myself, I'd like to do. I'd like to be able to pass a law saying you can't produce this stuff anymore. We don't do that because we value our freedoms. But with those rights that the producers of video games, in this case, have also come responsibilities, and that's been the partner to rights in our society. And I think what we're all saying is that we don't feel that this particular industry has carried out those responsibilities in the way that they should, and now's the time to change. And it's been my experience with my kids and other kids that it is true that I'm curious as to whether any of you know whether this is true, that boys tend to play these games much more than girls. Young boys tend to play much more than girls. Therefore, when I see the obvious sexual aggression against the woman in Night Trap, which kids do have access to, I worry that we're not only perpetuating the gender stereotypes we talked about in terms of skills, but we're running the risk of increasing the probability that these boys who are playing these games are going to be more sexually aggressive and abusive as a result of the experiences they've had with the games. Now, again, that's a personal, non-professional reaction. Is there anything in the literature or in your experience, your studies, to suggest that that's true?
And I think some of this stuff, in terms of the type of thing you're saying here, I mean, look at the portrayal of the woman there in the image from Night Trap. I mean, there are obviously sexual overtones operating there to a large degree.
I thought I was moved by your statement, which is one that parents must all feel, which is they wouldn't want their daughters going out with a boy who had just been playing one of these video games.
That's right.
Dr. Provenzo, you indicated that in your book, and I know you have in your book, state that video games are not only violent and sexist, but they're also racist. Can you just briefly give us a few examples of what you mean?
Sure. In interviews with children, what I found was that they talked about the ninjas as being bad. And then you asked them who the ninjas were, and they were sort of like the Japs and the Chinese. Yeah. And it turns out that they perceive Asians, any Asian, as being extremely violent. as being dangerous, as being evil. It's operating at a very basic level and at times simplistic. It carries over into other areas as well. There is depictions, I believe, although it's hard to prove, but my perception of homophobia operating in terms of how certain types of women are portrayed. I think that there are also things about race in terms of black and color issues that are clearly there. They're subtle and they're hard to get at sometimes, but I think they present a rather disturbing world.
Senator Dorgan.
Thank you very much. Ms. Droz, we have testimony that will be submitted later, some of which has already been submitted by Mr. Tom Zito, who's not with us, President and CEO of...
I am here, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Zito is here. I see. Okay, Mr. Zito has presented testimony. Mr. Zito says that Night Trap was set out to create a spoof of vampire films. And then Mr. White from SEGA, Vice President of SEGA, who will testify in the next panel, says in 5 mitigating points responding to the controversy over Night Trap is that the controversial scene, apparently the one we've just seen and the one I've seen before, is displayed only when the game player loses. Does that make you feel any better?
Oh, it makes me feel a lot better that if you're a loser, you're dead. No, it doesn't. We're dealing with self-esteem in here. There are many magazines out on the market, like the several I brought in here today. These magazines are filled with game tips on how to play the game, that in no time at all children become winners in kill, and their kill ratio goes up. It tells them the secret codes and exactly what to do to become successful in murder.
Commander Sims, at the beginning of Night Traps, looks at you straight in the eye and he says, quote, "If you don't have the brains or guts for this mission, then give control to someone who does." That's what it says at the beginning of the game.
If you don't have the brains or the guts for this assignment, give the controls to someone who does.
The head of the SWAT team, or excuse me, it's the SCAT. It's the SEGA something or other, SWAT team is what it comes down to. So there's this sort of fascist military type with a, police cap on looking at you and saying, if you're not man enough to do this, forget it, You don't deserve to play this game.
So obviously it's not directed for the other half of the population.
Mr. Zito, in his testimony, also says the only thing worse than a violent video game is the even more frightening suggestion of censorship. I understand his concern about censorship, and I guess since in the 13 years that I've served here in the United States Congress, that you will not find a congressional record that I've left that represents a belief in censorship. I think censoring what people can say or see or do or think is a trail that's a long, tortured, dangerous trail. I don't know exactly what the solution is, but I know that to those who produce Night Trap, my personal observation is I think it's pathetic and shameful that the conclusion of a game like that, a quote game unquote, is to drill into a woman's neck, to grab a woman with a metal hook. I mean, I don't view that as constructive entertainment. Now, should we censor it? I don't believe much in censorship, but moving down the road to try to find how do we prevent children from having access to that sort of glorification of violence, and I agree with Senator Lieberman, violence, I think, that is directed all too often against women.
In the past year, some very violent and offensive games have reached the market. And of course, I'm speaking about Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. And let me say that for the record, I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system. Obviously, it would not pass our guidelines. This game, which, as you've indicated, promotes violence against women, simply has no place in our society.
Thank you all. Mr. White, let me begin with you, and I suppose in one sense go to the heart of the matter. We saw the clip before from Night Trap with the woman being attacked, and I said earlier that I thought that violence was gratuitous and offensive and ought not to be available to people in our society. Mr. Lincoln, just here a few moments ago, as Vice President of the other leading company in this field, Nintendo, said, and I quote, "This game simply has no place in our society." Why don't you agree? Why doesn't SEGA just pull Night Trap off the market?
I think, Senator, with all due respect, the point I tried to make in my oral arguments and testimony was that this industry, as part of the interactive media industry, has grown tremendously. That children represent only a portion of the audience that we try to serve with our interactive software. Night Trap was developed specifically for an adult audience. SEGA took a leadership position in establishing an independent rating council and appropriately labeled Night Trap MA-17 not appropriate for children. And we believe, just as Congress has treated the motion picture industry, that we as an industry should have an opportunity to regulate ourselves, and believe that we've taken that first step this morning in developing an industry-wide coalition to adopt an industry rating system with enforcement.
I must say that the exercise of responsibility, do you think it's even appropriate for you to be pushing that stuff out there for adult audiences to use? I mean, it's...
Well, I think it's
with
appropriate.
the way in which the woman is attacked. I mean, clearly she's dressed provocatively. She's brutally attacked by the people dressed in dark clothes there. Is that... Why even... You've mentioned a list of products that your company produces. A lot of them are great. Why do you need to go across that line and produce this stuff for adults or kids?
Let me make 2 points. First, if you showed only the violent and gory scenes from out of context consecutively, one after the other, from Roots or Gone with the Wind, you might conclude they're horrible films. But in reality, they aren't. And what you've done is picked a particular segment of that game. Let me clarify. A winning effort within Night Trap saves the women. Your job as the player is to identify the villains and to trap them. If you are a good player, you keep the villains from the women and men who are potential victims. This game is an appropriate game for adults that choose to entertain themselves in this way, shape, and form.
If you're a bad player, what happens?
If you're a bad player, you will see that scene.
The woman gets attacked.
The woman gets attacked.
You're going to have a long way to go to convince me that you're raising anyone's values or reducing anyone's inclination toward aggression, and particularly aggression toward women, by putting this on the market.
We agree with much of what was said on the earlier panel. We believe that more research is necessary to conclude the effect that these games are having on both adults and children. The point we want to make is that
until the research is done.
Until the research is done, we feel it's an appropriate step to develop an industry-wide rating system which has enforcement that will allow adults, which represent 60% of the players for the SEGA CD system, to make the choice as to whether or not that game is right or wrong for them.
My question is, I guess my point is that I appreciate the rating system that you've adopted, and I guess my question is, would you accept the responsibility to try to make sure that every link in the chain that Nintendo is involved in, such as the advertisements and the brochures that we've discussed with Mr. White, follows out carries out your desires with the rating system?
Well, we'll certainly do that. You know, the point that I'm making, Senator, is that the game ratings, it just doesn't go far enough. We have to get our hands on the game content. And we've been doing that, but like any other system, it's not perfect. Let me make just a couple of other points. I can't sit here and allow you to be told that somehow the video game business has been transformed today from children to adults. It hasn't been, and Mr. White, who is a former Nintendo employee, knows the demographics as well as I do. Furthermore, I can't let you sit here and buy this nonsense that this SEGA Night Trap game was somehow only meant for adults.
I'm not
the fact of the matter is This is a copy of the packaging. There was no rating on this game at all when the game was introduced. Small children bought this at Toys R Us, and he knows that as well as I do. When they started getting heat about this game, then they adopted the rating system and put ratings on it. But today, just as I'm sitting here, you can go into a Toys R Us store or a Walmart or a Kmart, and you know as well as I do that you can buy this product and no one, certainly no sales clerk at retail, is going to challenge you. So the point I'm getting at is putting these ratings on, if that's as far as we're going to go, isn't going to get us anywhere. We've got to get further into this. And let me say that I agree.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your forthrightness. Thanks for assuming responsibility. I believe you've shown some leadership here. You're not perfect, as you've said, but you've been a damn sight better than the competition.
Senator, make a comment, please.
Today, Mr. Lincoln, on behalf of Nintendo, has accepted the idea of a rating system. They have previously been self-regulating more than you have. They chose not to produce Night Trap, and they have a clearly less violent version of Mortal Kombat out. You have a rating system, but I've still not today heard you accept responsibility for regulating the content of your games more than you already are.
In a typical video arcade, I saw one before Thanksgiving at the mall in Minneapolis, the largest mall of America, I believe they call it. Would you find Mortal Kombat,
Yes.
Night Trap?
You wouldn't find Night Trap, no. To my knowledge, I've certainly never seen Night Trap out in the commercial
Would you find Sega's version of Mortal Kombat in that arcade?
Well, in the coin-op, Mortal Kombat is not put out by either Sega or Nintendo. It's put out by a Illinois company.
Is there any supervision in those arcades that you're aware of? I mean, the reason I ask the question is I don't see a bunch of college sophomores crowding that arcade. I saw a bunch of kids playing video games. And the question is, if you've got video arcades where kids spend hours playing video games, is there any basis for believing that some of the more violent games are out of the reach of young children? In my judgment,
no,
not.
absolutely not. Night Trap, as an example, is not a coin-op piece. It is not out in coin-op. If you look through the list of the pieces that are available for the home market and the children, the vast majority of those are not out in coin-op.
Do you just say, well, here we're going to lay this on the market and let the buyer beware? If some kid can get access to it, fine. I understand that when Night Trap was released, it was not rated. And I might be wrong, but I understand that the first time you rated it at the 13 level. Is that not correct?
You're wrong, Senator. I'm sorry. The rating system went into effect in June. It was rated for the first time, and it was rated MA-17, and it was produced with that label on it from that point forward.
With respect to the question of the video arcade and the video games in which a woman is grabbed by the neck with a hook and drilled in the neck with a tool, and someone grabs the heart out of a character, we ought to have just as much concern about protecting our children against that sort of trash as we have in dozens of other areas in protecting our children. And I honestly, Mr. White, I read your statement, and I honestly think that you don't understand what we're talking about here. Let me tell you why. In your final point about Night Trap, you say this: finally, there is some research suggesting a short-term, momentary increase in playful, aggressive behavior after playing video games or watching violent television programs. There is no research concluding that this has any lasting impact. In fact, quite the opposite is true, you say.
As you indicated earlier, I went into, one of my staff members this morning went into a Toys R Us on the way to work, and Night Trap is right there alongside the other video games that the kids can buy. I want to show you two examples that deal with advertising. The first is this Toys R Us circular, and if you can see it, I think you'll see, Mr. White, in that case, that the ratings on Mortal Kombat are not visible. They've been covered over. Now, I know that's not your ad. You don't own Toys R Us, but I'm just trying to make the point of how important it is if you're really going to rely on your rating system to follow that through the chain. Second, we've got this ad for lethal enforcer that Senator Kohl has pointed to before, and the rating, which is on your package, is effectively, it's not visible. The carton is raised in such a way that it's covered it up. And of course, apart from that, and you'd have to look for it, I mean, one other exercise of responsibility here would have been simply to have had a mark somewhere else there saying this is MA-17. This shouldn't be bought or used by anyone under the age of 17. Final question for Mr. White and the panel. In your guidelines, you say that you're not going to approve products which contain material that denigrates any ethnic, racial, sexual, or religious group. Obviously, I think that night trap denigrates a sexual group, namely women.